Women in the civil rights movement. So, looking at the factors in the growth of the modern civil rights movement, we have to situate this again in the context of the post World War II um, time period. And this is a very significant shift that we see come about with the Cold War ideology, this idea that the U.S. is going to lead the free world and try to contain and squash communism. This becomes important rhetoric for the civil rights movement and for the leaders, because if the U.S. is the leader of the free world and the promoter of democracy and equality and all of these, founding principles of the nation, then the U.S. would also have to get itself in line and not just say these things, but actually do them. And making African Americans, especially, equal not only before the law, but also in an economic and societal sense, was part of that disclaimer. One thing that we see during the Cold War era is that a lot of communist nations, particularly the Soviet Union, criticized the U.S. for continuing to be racially unequal and segregated, right? And this was sort of a shame for the U.S. So you start to see federal advisors and the federal government doing more to support these efforts to be more racially equitable. And the first step we see towards that is with the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which was the first step towards desegregating the United States. And this particularly is in the public school system. But from here, we see other areas desegregate as well. There are civil rights organizations like CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, that in 1942 says their goal is to make equality a reality. And they start holding sit-ins to try to desegregate restaurants, businesses, right? The famous lunch counter sit-ins were a product of CORE. The Montgomery bus boycotts, you have, the image of Rosa Parks here, using this nonviolent civil disobedient strategy to protest against the segregated bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. And from this successful Montgomery bus boycott that leads to the desegregated buses by 1955 to 1956, we see the emergence of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights organization that was founded in 1957 and becomes sort of the poster organization. And, obviously Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the poster person for civil rights. Women's participation in the civil rights movement is also sort of changed from their work during World War II. The work that they did, the experiences they had, in a lot of ways energized them to this sort of activism in the 1950s and 1960s and beyond. There's obviously these real historic threads linking women to civil rights activism, going all the way back to the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. And many women were involved in the civil rights movement, perhaps more than men even. Obviously, they did not have the same sort of leadership roles and the sort of same, maybe, kind of pop culture notoriety, but they were nonetheless very integral to making this a successful movement. Women's involvement really kind of was not a feminist agenda too, right? These women were involved in these gender integrated groups like the NAACP, like the NAACP, like SCLC, like SNCC. They were not doing this as a feminist agenda. They were doing this as a community effort. And women's roles in the movement can sort of be summed up as what one sociologist, Belinda Robnett, has coined them as bridge leaders. Women organized grassroots campaigns, which meant that they were communicating to people on the ground and then communicating what the people were saying to the leaders of the movement, right? They were the ones sort of bridging that distance between what's going on the grassroots level and what's going on at the top. So even though they're not formal leaders, they were considered to be bridge leaders because they were so fundamental to bringing the needs of the people to the awareness of those that were making the decisions. A really important organization for women's participation in the civil rights movement was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, otherwise known as SNCC. SNCC was founded in 1960 with the help of Ella Baker. This is an image of Ella Baker, who worked with Martin Luther King Jr. in the SCLC, and she wanted to help these young, sort of bright-eyed, jean-wearing youths who wanted to start their own organization. She helped give kind of the organizing experience to this up-and-coming civil rights organization, which was SNCC. And SNCC was different compared to the other organizations of the time. It was more radical. It was much more egalitarian. They didn't have an official leader. They were inclusive to women, and they sort of prided themselves on this sort of democratic leadership style. So they helped participate in various sit-ins to desegregate, restaurants, businesses like CORE was doing back in the late 1940s. But they also participated in the Freedom Rides, helping to desegregate transportation systems, businesses across state lines. They also helped organize and participate in the 1963 March on Washington, which becomes a very symbolic moment in the civil rights movement. But one of the things they're most famous for was organizing the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where right before the election of 1964, they got a mass voter registration drive to register people in Mississippi to vote. And this was important because a lot of Mississippians were in rural areas that they didn't know sort of their constitutional rights and how to get around some of these black codes that kept them from being eligible or really having the courage and the knowledge of how to register to vote. So SNCC really helped to encourage this mass voter registration drive and set up what were known as freedom schools to help educate the people in these rural communities and empower them with, history of African American history and just knowledge of their constitutional and civil rights. So women were really important in this work. And the women in the issue of organizational titles became an issue, into the 1960s. Women were excluded from doing certain types of work that maybe were deemed scary or too harsh by some of the men. White women especially were delegated to clerical jobs in the office or cleaning the office, making the coffee, making food. So we sort of see that there's an extension of this sexist patriarchal belief even within this progressive radical organization, which was SNCC. So even despite some of these limitations, women still felt empowered by SNCC and other organizations at this time. And gender does not become a focus of these women's sort of gripes until the mid-60s. Their commitment to civil rights was more important than any other issue at this time. So here's some SNCC workers, Dory Lander and Casey Hayden, which you will be reading about in the chapter. the idea of sexism in the movement becomes by 1965, we see that the organization has become less egalitarian, less open to women, more hierarchical, less focused on grassroots activism, and there's sort of this elevated male militancy where gender inequality was the norm. African American women particularly felt torn at this time. Some would go into the women's movement later in the 1960s and 1970s, but there's still sort of a feeling of being committed to this sort of civil rights activism. Women wrote of having to sleep with male leaders in order to gain power. Stokely Carmichael, who once famously talks about what women's position in the movement is, and he says, quote unquote, women's position is prone, end quote, meaning that their position is to be on their back, right? They're supposed to be sort of the sexual side piece to the men. This really upset a lot of women, and this in some ways leads to Mary King and Casey Hayden's 1964 position paper, which is the first that really addresses women's feelings on sexism, and in a huge way helps to establish a new women's movement in the 1960s, what we'll know as second wave feminism, right? So sexism within the civil rights movement leads to the women's movement, which is huge. After 1965, we also start to see the civil rights movement just begin to fracture. There's a growth of Black power advocates that do not side with the nonviolent strategies that had dominated the civil rights movement up until this point. And so we just see this umbrella movement start to break down. Civil rights activism expands for Mexican Americans, activists especially. We see the community service organization that had many chapters across Texas, California, and a lot of the southwestern states that worked on just local issues that affected Mexican Americans. And it comes about after World War II, especially because a lot of Mexican American soldiers were not getting the benefits of the GI Bill. And so CSO helped to work to get these benefits for those veterans. We also see a lot of activism in the United Farm Workers Association with Cesar Chavez and Dorothy Huerta, who become obviously influential to organizing the farm workers, but at the same time are bringing other issues up related to civil rights and ethnic inequality amongst the Mexican American community. And for the most part, women have sort of a role as in the traditional sense. They're sort of in the supportive position. They're there to help with clerical aspects of the organizations. So they remain mostly traditional until the late 60s and early 70s, when we start to see a more female-centered Chicana movement that starts to address some sort of the chauvinism and machismo within the Mexican American Civil Rights Organization also. Lastly, looking at women in public policy during this time, we continue to see the battle over the ERA bill, the Equal Rights Amendment. The President's Commission on the Status of Women, President Kennedy organizes this Commission on the Status of Women to look at whether there were inequalities in the legal, economic, and social front for women. And this is a pretty big step that this commission is investigating. It's invested in making women's issues a priority for the federal government. And this ultimately leads to the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that is supposed to, from a legal perspective, make women's work and pay equal to men's. This will lead to greater rights and greater advocacy on the part of pay later on.